Sticking with the local developments, the need to renew the ANC has steadily become more urgent for the party. Its losses in the May election showed that it can no longer retain power by using a long and illustrious history to mask its deep flaws. The ANC has taken its first tentative steps towards the reform of the party and its relationship with the state. David Willams, editor-at-large for Financial Mail, joins us with more insights. Thank you so much for your time, David. Now, just to lay the foundation of the conversation, has a sense of staleness held the ANC back, and why has it not moved to adapt with the changing environment?
Well, good afternoon. The environment has changed, of course, with effect from May this year with the Government of National Unity. And it's interesting the calls for renewal, because in Nelson Mandela's time, as our story points out this week, he himself, Nelson Mandela, was calling for renewal in the ANC in the late 90s during his administration. And there have been calls over the years for renewal, reform, and so on. In 2017, for example, when Cyril Ramaphosa took over the ANC, there was a document that was put out by senior people in the party saying the party was guilty of deviant conduct, and it was uncompromising in criticism of corruption, of factionalism, of people out for themselves instead of working for the country and the party. And nothing happened as a result of this document. And I suppose, to be cynical, you could say, well, nothing's going to happen until your political survival is at stake. And really, this NEC meeting that happened over the last weekend, that focused on renewal and reform explicitly, which is perhaps the first time they've put it at the top of the agenda. And of course, it's because the electoral support has dropped to around 40%, losing power in several places, and worried about the 2026 municipal elections, where if the trend continues, the ANC will lose control of major metros like Johannesburg, eThekwini. In eThekwini, Durban, they govern with the DA. And of course, in Johannesburg, the DA is not part of a coalition. And then that raises, you can reform, but there are factions still within the ANC. And there's a view that the Gauteng Premier, Panyaza Lesufi, is not going with the national consensus because he feels he has enough support to defy the national leadership.
Well, I mean, David, you talk about the ANC's political survival being at stake, and really the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because we saw that materializing with the results that we saw in May that led to the formation of the GNU. Do you think that after years of the ANC calling for renewal and reform, that they finally heeded the warnings?
Well, there were warnings before, but the numbers in the elections didn't carry through with those warnings. Although ANC support dropped, they really did take it for granted for a long time that they would get a 50% plus majority. And so that was a real shock. But it's also a strange one, because most of their support went away to the Mkhonto weSizwe party, which is centered around Jacob Zuma. In KZN, they lost hugely to him, of course. So the other parties haven't really gained from the ANC in that election. It's the MK guys that do. Now, if we look at a world beyond Jacob Zuma, if he's no longer the magnet that holds that together, the ANC could then play it carefully to attract a lot of the MK members who've gone over back for whatever incentives they can find to get them back. That, however, is complicated, because in the Government of National Unity, although there are stresses and strains, the DA and the ANC are working together. They are DA ministers. And although we've never had such a situation before, the dynamic is changing all the time. And the longer the ANC stays in alliance with the DA nationally, which is in effect what it is, it might be more difficult to try and turn to get the MK members back. So the fact is, though, that they are now desperately, it would seem, focusing on reform. They want to start with the branches. I think they've taken the voters on the ground for granted for a long time, and they explicitly now say their renewal, as they call it, must come through branches on the ground. And they also talk about political education for all members, values, constitutionalism, and so on. Although they had their own school established several years ago, which was supposed to do that and didn't really do it.
David, it's so interesting, I mean, that you talk about the MK and the DA, because as you mentioned that the ANC lost some votes to the MK, and obviously now they're working very closely with the DA. So quite an interesting one, because does the ANC try to take a page out of the MK's book or out of the DA, or try to forge its own path? So that's going to be quite an interesting development. But under this reform agenda, how fast would the ship be able to turn direction?
Well, if you look at 2026 is not a long time away. It's less than 2 years to the municipal elections. So the ship would need to turn pretty quickly. There's been a lot of focus in Johannesburg on how the administration of Johannesburg is failing. There's water crisis, there's electricity crisis. Eskom may have got the lights on, but they're not always on in Johannesburg.
Yeah.
And there are serious questions about how the city has been run and how the province has been run. We quote the view in the cover story this week in the FM about Panyaza Lesufi being very good at sort of street theatre politics and coming up with big plans for new railway lines to Limpopo and so on. But on the ground, although he's making the right noises now about trying to fix Johannesburg itself, trying to fix the city, it is a lot of work to be done, a lot of backlog to be made up. So in the end, I suppose, if the ANC wants to regain support, it's got to deliver. It's got to deliver. We talk about service delivery protests. It's got to be seen to be delivering to people. And there's a lot to do before the 2026 election. And as I say, it does also come back to the factions within the ANC. We don't know where Deputy President Paul Mashatile stands. He's known to be close to Panyaza Lesufi, or has been perceived to be. So where will the national versus Gauteng dynamic play out? In KZN, the ANC is cooperating in a coalition government with the DA. They're not doing it in Gauteng, they are doing it nationally. Now, these are all going to cause stresses and strains within the ANC, also within the DA, but they're not trying to regain power, they're trying to increase their influence. Yeah. So on the one hand, its reform is obviously necessary, but who's going to be doing it? And the other issue, of course, is President Ramaphosa only has 2 years after next year to go before the NEC elects a new leader. And although he is president until 2029, that doesn't necessarily mean if there's a new leader who is elected in 2027, whether it becomes tenable. And I remember the ANC used to talk about 2 centers of power. Is it possible to have a leader of the party who's not the president for 2 years? And then that raises the question of Cyril Ramaphosa being a lame duck president. You know, he's president in name, but will anyone be listening to him because they know his time's running out? So these are all dynamics. It's not simply a question of getting your voters list restored and digitizing your membership lists.
I mean, David, it's quite interesting also that you talk about these factions, and we know the factional battles over the years have really distracted the ANC from doing the actual job that they need to be doing in order to be boosting the economy and really doing the work. And I'm wondering at this point if there could be a possibility of a breakup in the ANC, or maybe that being a necessity.
Well, if you've got the electoral system is such that the party appoints its MPs, and whoever controls the party list controls the proportion in Parliament. So as long as the ANC has the percentage it does in Parliament, although it's much reduced, it can control who is in those seats in Parliament. So if the ANC were to split, it would depend on which part of it would retain constitutionally, internally, the power to run the ANC. And if you go on the outside, you could be in the very cold weather if you no longer have the patronage of being able to appoint MPs. If we had constituency MPs, then the party could split very quickly, and you retain your seat in Parliament even if you split from the party. But that can't happen in our electoral system.
It's going to be very, very interesting developments there to look out for. Thank you so much for your time and just giving us analysis on that, David. That was Financial Mail's David Willams.